Okay, so next we're going to look more specifically at monetary policy and inflation and how that relationship um, evolves. So I don't know if you guys have seen this in the media, but most media discussions of inflation focus on the short run when the price index can fluctuate to really short term events like oil price shocks, labor union shocks, and strikes, or even in an environment that we're living in right now where we have a pandemic, right? Very short run, temporary things. In the long run, empirical studies show, right? Studies using data collected from the real world show that excessive growth in the money supply results in inflation. So we talked about hyperinflation in a previous chapter, and it basically was the result of a country just printing money excessively, right? Without any regard for the ramifications. And so, as we saw in those examples of hyperinflation, like Zimbabwe, um, we saw that there's a direct connection between money supply and inflation. And that's basically what we're going to discuss here. And again, we can use our simple supply and demand analysis to look at this. We can look at why price levels rise when the money supply increases. If the supply of money expands relative to the demand for money, basically what happens is that people have more money balances than they really desire. And so their spending on goods and services increases. And when that happens, prices go up. Basically, what it means is that people have extra money, so they go out and buy more. And ultimately, in the short run, it leads to a situation where there are some shortages. And when there are shortages, that provides a pressure for prices to increase. And so this is kind of the mechanisms through which an increase in the money supply leads to higher inflation. Now, we can look at something called the equation of exchange to kind of see how this is all interconnected. So the equation of exchange is a formula that indicates the number of monetary units, right? The amount of money, MS, the supply of money, multiplied by the number of times that the supply of money is spent on goods and services, something called velocity, or V, is going to be equal to the price level times real GDP. Okay, so it's an equation that shows the relationship between changes in the quantity of money in circulation, the money supply, MS, and the price level. Okay, so here's our equation. It's an identity. That's why it has this weird thing with 3 bars that kind of looks like an equal sign, but it basically means that this is an identity. It's true by definition. And so again, MS is the money balances held by non-banking public. So this is basically the money supply. V is the income velocity of money. So again, this is the amount of times the money supply is turned over in a year. How many times is the money supply spent in a year? So, if we were in a hypothetical economy where the only money that existed was a single dollar bill, how many times is that dollar bill spent, right? That's the velocity of money. And then on the other side, we have price and real GDP. So the price level or the price index and real GDP per year. I already described this, but if you want to see it again, income velocity of money, again, it's the number of times per year a dollar is spent on final goods and services. And it's equal to the nominal GDP divided by the money supply. Nominal GDP, as it turns out, is price level times real GDP. So going back here, if we want to solve for V, we just take nominal GDP, which is P times Y, and divide it by the money supply. All right, like I said, this is an identity, which is why it has 3 bars instead of just 2. It means a bit more than just equals. It's equal because of how these things are defined. And so basically what this equation is telling us is that the total funds spent on output, which is money supply times velocity, right? This is the total amount of money spent on output, right? So again, if there's only $1 if $1 is the money supply and it's spent 5 times, which would 5 would be the velocity, then there has been $5 worth of value and output, right? So hopefully that helps you. So the amount spent on final output has to equal the total funds received for that output, which is given by nominal GDP, price level times real GDP. Right? And so that's exactly what we're seeing. The value of goods purchased, this, is equal to the value of goods sold, this, right? So that's where our equation is coming from. That's why it is defined the way it is. That's why it's an identity. All right, so this leads us to something called the quantity theory of money and prices. And basically this theory or this hypothesis says that changes in the money supply lead to equiproportional changes in the price level. If we assume that velocity and real GDP are constant, they're not changing, then an increase in the money supply, say by 20%, can lead only to a 20% increase in price levels. So that's what we mean by equiproportional. Okay, so here we are. If the money supply goes up by 20% and V and Y are staying the same, then P has to also go up by 20%. That's called the quantity theory of money and prices. So in other words, to roughly, I'm paraphrasing here, but to quote, I believe, Milton Friedman, inflation is everywhere a monetary issue. So inflation just comes from the fact that the Fed is engaging in monetary policy. All right, so to wrap this section up, let's look at the relationship between money supply growth rates and the rate of inflation. And as you can see, there's a very, very distinct positive correlation between these things, right? So here we've got the rate of money supply growth. How quickly is the money supply growing? In the United States, it's very low. It's somewhere around, well, keep in mind that this is a log scale. So going from 1 to 10 has the same distance as going from 10 to 100, has the same distance as going from 10 to 1,000. So this is a log scale, not a linear scale. So this is probably somewhere around, you might guess 5, but it's actually more around 2 or 3. And then same thing up here, we've got a ratio scale or a log scale, in other words. But you can see that countries that have lower growth rates in the money supply also have lower inflation. And in fact, it almost looks like a 1-to-1 relationship, right? Which is exactly what we just talked about, right? If the money supply grows by 20%, then inflation should be 20% as well. A 1-to-1 relationship. This chart is telling us that the quantity theory of money is dead on, right? It's basically true given the empirical evidence. All right, let's think about a behavioral example. Can behavioral economics explain the Federal Reserve's bad forecasts? The Fed has systematically predicted higher growth of real GDP than actually occurs. Not really great, since basically a buttload of economists work there. Why might this be? Well, behavioral economists offer an explanation for this observed bias. An innate preference for real GDP to increase by larger amounts. Okay, so the Fed, this is what the Fed wants in part. So since that's what it wants, to increase real GDP, it's basically biased, right? It wants this, and so that's what it predicts. But also, Fed officials' overconfidence in their own abilities, which causes them to refuse to admit systemic mistakes. Okay, so some behavioral biases going on at the Fed. They want higher real GDP, so that's what they predict, and they are overconfident about their abilities to predict these things. Pretty interesting. Maybe we need more behavioral economists.